We've seen so many of these DATs pop up, but this one, another big boy to discuss, because now we have Helius raising $500 million from, as I said, Pantera. Dare I say that 164% move in a day off of DAT news isn't even getting me excited anymore. That's how high the bar is, ladies and gents. All right, welcome in everybody to another episode here of Coinage. Excited to be chatting a busy week, a week that we've been waiting for when it comes to a key Fed decision. We're going to be getting that this week as we hear from Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The market's digesting all of what is going into that decision. Of course, crypto taking a bit of a breather, but we have a lot of news to discuss on today's show, and excited to have along for the ride with us today eToro's U.S. investment and options analyst, Brent Kenwell, on the show. Brent, it's good to see you, man. Thanks for hopping on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is exciting because, for a number of reasons. Obviously, of course, it's been ups, it's been downs, it's been everybody thinking that maybe we'll get a cut, maybe we won't. But now, overwhelmingly, the market seems to be on the same page for this one, expecting, I was just looking this morning, the odds are around 97% that we will see a 25 bips cut. Where do you put this at as we have Bitcoin kind of holding around that 115, a nice little bounce over the weekend? What says Brent when it comes to this right now?
Yeah, you mentioned the 97% chance for a 25 basis point cut. The rest of the percentages for a 50 basis point cut. So the consensus is that we are going to get a cut here this Wednesday afternoon, and I think that's in line with what the Fed will do. If we go back, probably about a month now, when Chairman Powell spoke in Jackson Hole, he said, it's time for us to shift our monetary policy, our approach to interest rates, given the current data we're seeing around the labor market. So I think that was him. And Powell's the type of guy who keeps his cards close to the chest. He does not say what he's going to do or what the Fed's going to do unless it is very certain that they're going to do that. So I think they are going to make that pivot this Wednesday. Unfortunately, I think because of the way the Fed is viewing the macro environment, so as kind of a refresher, the Fed's dual mandate is stable prices, i.e. inflation, and maximum employment. And so right now, both of those things are kind of moving in the wrong direction. Inflation's been creeping higher and the labor market's been weakening. So with that being said, I think if we only had one part of that equation, like the jobs market softening, the Fed would be able to act quickly and aggressively with monetary policy to sort of address that. But with inflation moving the wrong way, that kind of handcuffs them a little bit. I think will make them a little bit slower than they would typically like to be. Mm-hmm. But, I think investors can still find positives, silver linings around the situation. Rates are going lower. That's a positive. So we'll see how that is reflected in risk on assets as we go forward for the rest of the month.
Yeah, as we look at, if you think about the month itself, it's been interesting because people like Tom Lee, obviously permanently bullish most of the time, and we had him on the show not too long ago talking about why he is so constructive on the price of Ethereum. And of course, as Ethereum goes, most times also goes the rest of the altcoin space. But the granddaddy of them all is Bitcoin. And you guys were kind of looking at Bitcoin seasonality. I think we also have a chart of kind of how these things have performed. In September, almost everybody knows, September, not historically a very good month, but it has been interesting to think about how this year, I know these words are dangerous, Brett, I'm sure you'd back me up on this, but this time may be different. And looking at all that stuff, I do think it is interesting just to think about how much the market may come to expect the same thing this September, but maybe not the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So far we have, the S&P's hitting all-time highs, the Nasdaq's, working on its 9th straight up day. Bitcoin is up, I think 5 or 6% for the month. So far September not really being that scary, swoony month that it has its reputation for. And to be fair, that reputation extends not only for Bitcoin over the last decade, but also equities. It is by far tends to be the weakest month seasonally speaking. But I think, I think it's really all an investor's mindset and time frame, the way they approach something like seasonality. First, I don't think you can solely bank on seasonality. It's just sort of one component to be aware of and to be mindful of. I wouldn't bet the farm, on seasonality playing out. Otherwise, there'd be no difficulty in markets, right? You would just buy the seasonally strongs and sell the seasonally weaks. But I still think of it, from a longer term perspective. I view those seasonally weak periods as opportunities. You look at something like Bitcoin, and it might be, easy or scary to say, oh, September tends to be a bad month. Okay, well, October tends to be its best month by far, and Q4 tends to be its best quarter by far. So, when you look at it from that perspective, if we did see a pullback in Bitcoin, I would view that more as an opportunity rather than a scenario that you run away from.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of what makes this week unique in the sense of, we don't know what kind of chop we're going to get, particularly for the same reason, because it may be the case that everybody is now still on the same page of, hey, Fed's going to cut. And I think it will come down to what we hear from Jay Powell. But I do think that is kind of interesting because I'd be remiss, of course, we talk so much about why September's tough, but this is kind of the first September that we're also seeing a massive swing in terms of DATs, these digital asset treasury companies come out of nowhere that are buying up a bunch of crypto as well. So that could be fueling things this time around. I think obviously it's a big chunk of it. You've also tracked kind of the ETF flows. This is a new time where you do have not just the DATs, but also the ETFs for ways to kind of allocate to all this. But you guys are also out with a new retail report. eToro always does this. I think it's really good to get a pulse on retail investors. And it was kind of surprising to see confidence coming back writ large, even though we're going to have to see Jay Powell kind of choose between, does he care more about inflation or does he care about a weakening economy and jobs market? And surprising to see in your guys' report, more people still pretty confident.
So confident. To be honest with you, so this survey, we survey 10,000 retail investors every quarter, and we've done this for several years now. So we have a pretty good backlog of data, and it's really an interesting way to, like you mentioned, taking the pulse of the retail investor. It's a really straightforward way of doing it, even though it does result in a lot of data, and digging through it sometimes can be a little cumbersome. But it really took me back, to be honest with you, with how confident investors were. This confidence is not just, are you optimistic on your portfolios or pessimistic? It's really a range of about 7 questions around confidence, and that's everything from job security to cost of living, income, financial goals. How confident are you in the U.S. economy, the global economy? Really, just a broad barometer of confidence. And across that whole metric, we had basically our highest confidence ratings ever. There's various levels of confidence. There's, we kind of measure like net confidence, and then things like sort of confident, very confident. Our very confident scores came back as the highest we've ever had them come back. So retail investors are confident across the board. And the reason that's surprising to me is when you look at the macro headlines, there's all this concern. There's all these worries about the labor market over the last couple of months. Inflation has sort of been creeping back. It's been increasing over the last several months as well. So there's a lot of reasons from a headline perspective that I thought investors would be a little more tepid in their responses. And we just did not see that. If you ask me why, I unfortunately don't actually have the specific reason for each respondent. My guess would be they looked at their portfolios. These are investors. They're identified as retail investors. They're involved in the markets, and we already know investors were big buyers back in early April and through May. And so their portfolios, they have a great basis, regardless really of what asset class they're after. A lot of tech, a lot of crypto, a lot of gold even. And all 3 of those assets have performed very, very well over the last 6 months. So I think that stems from a lot of the confidence.
Yeah, the other big thing to maybe assess when it comes to confidence, we got some insights on this as well, as we've continued to see more and more companies come to market and through IPOs. Of course, kind of kick things off with Circle, the issuer of USDC, the big stablecoin company, and then of course Bullish. And on Friday, we got Gemini as well from the Winklevoss twins. I think it is kind of an interesting, I'm looking at 2 things. I don't know if you do the same outside of course, the great research you do by polling retail investors. But outside of that, I'm just looking at how these things have been trading. And Gemini holding at 32, call it $33 a share right now. And in that IPO, it was just a few weeks ago that they were floating the idea of these shares being priced at like $17. So to me, that still kind of shows how much public investors, the public markets, are valuing, I guess, the picks and shovels play, if you want to call Gemini that. The idea of a Coinbase as well, obviously been up and down through this part of the cycle. But what does that maybe say to you, just in terms of how much more room we may have to run?
Yeah, I think it speaks really highly of risk appetite among investors, and that's, I don't know that it's, I wouldn't really say that's specific to now. I think a big component to a strong, healthy bull market is an appetite for the new issues, for the IPOs, for the companies that are newly coming public. You want to see those the ranges of the offering get upped. As we get close, it shows that demand is strong. You want to see and then we want to see a strong open and a strong trade out of the gate, and for the next couple days and next couple weeks, and I think we had that sort of that wrinkle, in early Q2, late Q1, where the economic uncertainty was starting to get very high. There was all these concerns about tariffs. The markets were obviously very volatile. Volatile environments are very hard for companies to go public, and they're trying to raise as much money as they can, and they want to have a successful IPO. No one wants to see their range get reduced and then have a poor opening. So we want strong markets for new IPOs, and luckily we've had that for the last few months. We've been seeing companies come back to it, as you mentioned, Gemini being kind of the most recent within the crypto space. And so far, the receptions have been very strong. I think that's very promising as we turn the page to Q4 and as we kind of look into 2026 and companies are starting to get more IPOs on the books. It's been sort of a slower IPO year because of that Q1, Q2 wrinkle, but it's setting up for a good back half of the year and a good 2026, as long as we don't see this, another huge wave of volatility come through. I think it speaks highly of the risk appetite we see right now.
Well, you did mention the idea of, I'm just going to bring a Bitcoin chart back up. You mentioned kind of this risk of potential sell-offs coming this week. And of course, I don't even think it's the decision necessarily that markets are going to be watching. It's going to be what Jay Powell says in the presser after, and really kind of looking forward to whether or not it is true that what he said at the Jackson Hole speech is going to hold, that they really are focused more on the labor market than they are on the inflation front. But in terms of that, I know you were putting out some kind of like price calls around how healthy you think this is. I mean, some people were getting worried when we were moving down. Now holding around 115, you said you'd be supportive here on any dips we might get. Obviously, we all know, if you go back to your seasonality data, Q4, very strong for crypto. Last year was no different. So how do you kind of, I guess, parse what people should be listening to when Jay Powell speaks this week, and what kind of moves, given the health of the market, what you'd expect to see?
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm kind of looking at this as like a good news, bad news situation. It's good news, I think, that the Fed is going to move. I think it's time for them to cut rates based on the macro data. But, the bad news side of that is, it kind of sets us up for a possible, and this is me putting on my, my investor, my trader hat, but kind of sets us up for a possible sell the news type of reaction. We see this routinely when a certain expectation is there and the asset price climbs into that deadline or into that event. And then when the scenario plays out that's expected, we tend to see a sell the news reaction. And that's very possible that we get this week, or, really even that something that could continue through the back half of September. We're only halfway through the month. It's been a solid month, but, with that Fed decision there, and maybe what Powell says, I do agree with you that what he says is more important than what the Fed is going to do, given that we know what the Fed's going to do. So it's sort of that outlook, that viewpoint that he gives us in terms of how the Fed is going to maneuver monetary policy moving forward, that could set us up for a possible sell the news type of reaction. And whether we get that in equities or crypto, and I do think that in this scenario, they will go hand in hand from a correlation perspective. But if we do get that sell off, I think it's kind of that sell-off that refreshes and could set us up for a really strong Q4. As you mentioned, in terms of price support or price levels, when I'm looking at something like a Bitcoin, obviously everyone's got to keep a very close eye on that 100,000 level. It's a key level, I think, psychologically. If we just look purely at the price action, that 107 to like 110 range, that was resistance for a long time. It's been support so far. So I think that's really the first layer for me to keep an eye on. And then if we go below that, somewhere in that 98 to 100 range would be an interesting spot.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it now, I mean, I don't know, putting all of it into context, obviously, as the data shows, September, usually not the best month, but so far, so good, as we are remaining in the green for now. So obviously, all of this could change come Fed decision time. But we will see, and we will see all that play out. But Brett, can't thank you enough for coming on, man. This is great. And obviously, as we always say, we appreciate the data you bring to us from eToro in that survey you do. Got to come back on. Got to give us some more data here to play with. And obviously, after the Fed makes their call here, we'd love to have you back on, chat more things through.
Yeah, I'd love to be back on. Thanks for having me today.
Right on. Thanks so much. That there, of course, Brent Kenwell, eToro U.S. investment and options analyst, joining us here on Coinage. It's going to be a busy week. As I said, it's not just the Fed decision that we are keeping our eyes on here at Coinage. It's also the trend that we've been seeing play out time and time again. We got another one to keep our eyes on. We mentioned so much of the other DATs in the space, but we got one yet again to talk about on today's show. That, of course, being the Pantera-backed new Solana DAT. We've seen so many of these DATs pop up, but this one, another big boy to discuss, because now we have Forward, Kyle Samani, Multicoin, big Solana backers in their play for their Solana DAT, but now also Helius, raising $500 million from, as I said, Pantera and a few others. Summer Capital shares in that one up considerably today. Let me see if I can bring up a chart in just a second. But these are the trends that we continue to watch, because if you have been paying attention, it's also been quite constructive for Solana's price over the last few weeks, outperforming the likes of ETH and Bitcoin. A pretty healthy chart as we bring this one up here, Ralph. Pretty healthy chart when it comes to like Solana's pricing because of those big buys coming from Solana DATs. And a lot of them now coming to market. And so, I don't know, I think it's something that's important to consider here in terms of whether or not those buys will continue, whether or not ETH comes back into pole position when it comes to some of the support from these DATs. But another one for us to track, it's getting quite busy. Not just Ford, but now also Helius. Let me see if I can bring up shares in that one as well, because 200% in the move is not as much, by the way, as we saw with the WorldCoin DAT not too long ago. It was, I think I want to say a 1,200% move. This one holding at 164 right now. So still a move, but dare I say, it is kind of crazy to think, dare I say that 164% move in a day off of DAT news isn't even getting me excited anymore. That's how high the bar is, ladies and gents. But still, obviously, if you're one of the people writing checks into these, you're doing just fine on a 162% pop. So you're feeling pretty good about that one. And of course, if you're a Pantera who has allocated, as we've had Cosmo Zhang on the show a few times here, Coinage NFT holder, I should point out. If you're Pantera and you've already bet on some other Solana DATs, bringing in some more firepower here, raising $500 million in the first placement to get it off the ground, not too bad of a bazooka to be backing up your position on that one either. So we'll keep our eyes on Helius as that one continues to roll out and try and track some of the purchases made by that DAT now too. Of course, the other one, as we mentioned, let me see if we can bring up Ford here as well. Not the auto company. Don't make that mistake, ladies and gents, but Forward Industries. I want to bring up that chart because we've been keeping our eyes on that one since they also announced. And those shares still performing pretty well as well. So just a lot of things to track, but that continuing to be why we are seeing Solana outperform. And just wanted to bring that one up and kick off, after we say goodbye to Brett, the rest of the show with that, because I think it's important. The other big important piece of what we saw play out was also on Friday. It wasn't just the Gemini IPO, but it was also the announcement of Tether's USAT American-focused stablecoin. It was a pretty interesting launch. We were over there, packed room full of a lot of high-powered people. And if you think about this launch, I think it was pretty interesting to kind of reflect on the idea of the way that they rolled this one out. Obviously, squarely now taking on Circle and USDC. Tether had almost always been focused more so on global countries outside of the US with the way that they've grown Tether, USDT. But now, with the launch of USAT, very squarely setting its target on Circle and bringing the fight back here stateside. So I think it is kind of interesting to think about how different the way that these stablecoins will be going head-to-head. The other big news is Bo Hines, the old White House crypto executive director, Trump's right-hand man on crypto, had announced he was already leaving, and now was introduced up there on stage as the leader of USAT. So going to be interesting to see how Bo integrates USAT into various different things that could be more America-centered than Tether and USDT itself. I think, Ralph, if you just scroll down on the right side, I think we have the video further below. Those are just the pictures, but yeah, so we will continue to track all of that. Obviously, it's a huge development when it comes to how these stable coins might go back and forth. It's all right. We don't need to focus too much on it. We can move on from it. Mostly because the ad was pretty interesting again in the way that it was an audience of people still to this day trying to wrap their heads around what stable coins are all about. It's shocking, folks. Sometimes you think that most of the world has already woken up to these things, and a lot of people are caught flat-footed about how stablecoins are going to change the game. It's shocking, I would say, in terms of how much room we still have to run in that adoption. But I do not think it's a stretch of the imagination to think by the end of the year we will see at least one of these companies. Someone's got to be doing it. Someone's got to be working on it right now. That we will see a huge company, the likes of an Amazon or a Walmart. We already saw those headlines a few months ago. So you know these discussions are happening. We will see one of those huge giant corporations wake up and realize, oh, wait, we should have our own stablecoin. And then I think everyone who's been working is going to pull forward what they've been working on. And then the cat's out of the bag. And then we get huge moves in terms of all of this money coming on chain. So a lot of that, I think, is going to be happening for some time. To wrap up the year. But anyways, an interesting back and forth, and also very interesting to think about the way that Tether chose to launch that one with all of these titans of industry. We were talking, there were a few different Congress people there, huge heads of companies there. Obviously, Cantor was there, Anchorage Digital was there. Both of those companies going to be involved in the issuance and custody for USAT, so not a surprise that they would be there. But outside of them, very packed room. In fact, Kyle Samani also there for Multicoin. So you had a few different leaders of DATs, whether they're Ethereum DATs or Solana DATs, and Kathy Wood. Everyone was there. And I think that that's pretty interesting to think about how Tether chose to handle this launch versus the way that even President Trump not too long ago chose to launch his meme coin, where he had hosted the crypto gala, if you remember that. He had the crypto gala, and he had everyone who was important in that room, and then launched the meme coin outside the room. Basically, no one knew that that was going to be happening. And if you think about the way that that changes the way people in their head think about things and whether or not they're on the inside or the outside, I think that's just fascinating. It's a fascinating kind of way of thinking about, are you in the crypto cool crowd or are you outside of it? And when you consider kind of the way that Tether chose to handle this, I think that it was pretty smart to have everybody in the room, have crypto native people there, and basically it was the exact opposite of what we saw Trump and his meme coin do. And so when you consider all those points, gotta say, Tether definitely put some thought into, hey, how do we want to position USAT? And I'm kind of intrigued. I'm excited to see what they have coming out in terms of how they plan to integrate it. As I said, with all these other US-focused companies and US-focused projects, certainly Coinage is one of those, being here in the US, as are a lot of the others focused on American users, and some of those partnerships TBD. So I don't know. Pretty big, pretty exciting to see Tether make that push. Now bringing stable coins, at least focused on the American user. Still kind of overlapping with Tether, by the way, in terms of remittances being top of mind and the rest of the like, but pretty interesting to think about how those battles are going to shape up and what position that now puts Circle and USDC in as Tether brings the stablecoin war stateside. So bring out your knives, man. I think it's going to start to get interesting in stablecoin land. For a space that's as boring as, hey, we're just a stable coin over here, we're always trading at $1, things are about to get a little bit more exciting than just that. But as always, those are the big headlines. Of course, we're going to be carrying the news come Wednesday on the Fed decision. Still, as of right now, as we covered with Brett just a few minutes ago, still the overwhelming expectation, maybe you don't like Fed Watch. Maybe you're more of a crypto degen and you're like, hey, Zach, I don't trust those numbers. I want to know what's going on over there at Polymarket. I meant to bring this up as well. But basically right now, only about a 9% chance that you might see more than a 25 bips cut. Not saying it's impossible. 9%, that's about 3 times as much as the FedWatch tool says it will be. So perhaps a bit more bullish, a bit more dovish the traders on Polymarket, a lot of people have been making a lot of what Polymarket predicts instead of the traditional markets. I don't know. I don't know if I want to wade into that so much, but right now, if you do look at the odds on Polymarket, much higher that you might get a 50 bips cut than what we're seeing on the Fed Watch tool. Of course, we'll get the answer on Wednesday. Per usual, you can check out all the big headlines in and around Web3 at coinage.media and Mint to co-own our project as always. For everybody here at Coinage, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again soon. I'm Zach Guzman, signing off.